Welcome, everyone. I'm Julia Brookins, Senior Program Analyst for Teaching and Learning at the American Historical Association. Greetings from the AHA, and thank you for attending. Our program today introduces the AHR Syllabus project, the first dedicated space for discussions about teaching and learning in the pages of the American Historical Review. This event is also the inaugural installment of AHA Learn, a new series of online programs that will provide a forum for compelling ideas in history education. Individual sessions will showcase new resources, revisit enduring concerns, or highlight innovative strategies to ensure student success in today's classrooms. Today's event will begin with an introduction to the AHR Syllabus project by American Historical Review editor Mark Bradley and by Kathleen Hilliard, Vice President of the AHA's Teaching Division. Then, two project contributors will describe their components. After that, we'll move into breakout rooms so that you can discuss one of the modules with its creators before returning to this larger group for a brief conclusion. Lastly, please note that this is being recorded. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our two moderators. Mark Philip Bradley is the editor of the American Historical Review and the Bernadette E. Schmidt Distinguished Service Professor of History at the University of Chicago. He is an international historian of empire and the post-colonial in Asia and the United States. Bradley is the author of The World Reimagined, Americans and Human Rights in the 20th Century, Vietnam at War, and Imagining Vietnam in America, The Making of Post-Colonial Vietnam, which won the Harry J. Benda Prize from the Association for Asian Studies. He's currently writing an intellectual and cultural history of the Global South, supported by a fellowship from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. Kathleen Hilliard is the Vice President of the AHA's Teaching Division and Associate Professor of History at Iowa State University. In her work with the AHA, she aims to create spaces and resources for educators to share tools and sharpen students' inquiries about the past and about the structures and communities in which they live. She's currently working on two research projects, including Dark Bargain, Love, Murder, and Vengeance in the Old South with Lawrence McDonnell, and Bonds Burst Asunder, The Revolutionary Politics of Getting By in Civil War and Emancipation, 1860 to 1867. Now I'll hand it over to Mark and Kathy.
Great. Julia, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you for showing up late in the day. It's great to have you here, and it's great to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about this new initiative, which is a joint project between the American Historical Review and the AHA's Teaching Division. What Kathy and I are going to do quickly at the top here is talk just a little bit about the hashtag AHR Syllabus project itself, kinds of modules that are a part of it, how you can gain access to it in your teaching. And then we're going to spend most of our time together with deep dives into two of the modules, one on historical gaming and the other on rethinking teaching historiography in the classroom through a module on Holocaust historiography and the use of testimonial. We are really lucky to have the two authors of those modules with us, and I want to just introduce both of them to you at the top. Tori Olsson is an associate professor of U.S. history at the University of Tennessee. And his prize-winning first book, Agrarian Crossing, focused on the making of the U.S.-Mexican borderlands. He has a new book just out in August titled Red Dead's History, a Video Game, an Obsession in America's Violent Past. And that draws on his teaching with video games in the classroom at Tennessee. And it's the focus of his hashtag AHR Syllabus module. We also have Aya Marczyk here, who is a Curriculum Development Fellow at Yale's Fortuna Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies. She is a Penn PhD grad, and her research explores how teaching with historiography can create bridges between the work of professional historians and high school classrooms. Her module for the AHR syllabus is focusing on teaching historiography of the Holocaust through testimonials, as I suggested earlier. So just a couple of brief words about the syllabus before I hand this over to Kathy. These modules, and as you'll come to know them over the course of this hour, are really wonderful illustrations of the kind of larger principles that guide this project. The modules are designed to help teachers kind of take a look under the hood at the way in which historians are making history in the early 21st century. They're designed in a kind of grab and go fashion. The idea is that there's stuff there that's just going to be easy to take and run with in your classroom. And we've just launched the first of these modules on historical smells in the most recent AHR of September. That's the thing that's behind me here. It's the first time that the AHR has really dealt with teaching in its pages. And so it was a big shift for us, one that we're excited about, but one that meant that we really needed some help with. And we turned to the AHA's teaching division for that help. And it's been a really, really wonderful partnership between us and the teaching division in just trying to figure out what it was that AHR could bring to the table that was different than what teachers could get in terms of teaching history from other resources that they're familiar with. So Kathy, can I hand it over to you to talk a little bit about how we got to where we are?
Great. Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here on the ground floor of this exciting new collaborative initiative for AHR and the AHA Teaching Division. The project is thought-provoking, it's innovative, it's fun, and I think it squares the circle on so much of what we do as scholars and educators. It's also important. Much of the broader public, and yes, many of our students, continue to believe that history teaching involves nothing more than the rote narration of names, dates, and facts. So I can't think of a better way to turn that narrative on its head, sharing the what, the how, and the why of history and its broader significance in the world in which we live. Everything has a history, we like to say here at the AHA, and the story behind AHR Syllabus is worth hearing. The seeds of this project were planted the summer and fall before I came onto the AHA Council. And looking back at the personalities involved, I have to say it almost seems inevitable that this happened. You know, what happens when you take the boundless enthusiasm and energy of my predecessor, Laura McEnany, and combine it with the thoughtful insights of teaching division counselor Katerina Matro and the out-of-the-box thinking of an editor like Mark? Well, what you get is true creative combustion, exploding old assumptions about teaching's place in our lives as scholars and charting a new path forward for the journal. In the fall of 2021, Mark and the teaching division convened 5 Zoom focus groups, capturing suggestions and insights from educators in high schools, liberal arts colleges, community colleges, and regional publics. And almost from the beginning, teaching division and the steering committee centered our thinking around the idea of a syllabus. Initially, a series of 15 or so modules or articles that might help teachers take students under the hood of the work we do as historians. And the conversations we had in those early stages were invigorating and absolutely confounding. You know, how on earth could we capture the depth and the breadth of what we do in a 15-part syllabus? Well, an answer emerged as we thought about what a syllabus is and what it does. From semester to semester and from year to year, a good syllabus undergoes constant revision. It is a dynamic, living thing, reflecting new scholarship, new students, new technology, new pedagogy. So too, we came to understand that, you know, the AHR syllabus had to do the same thing. So what started out as a short-term project evolved into a permanent place for the discussion of teaching in the American Historical Review. I couldn't be more excited for this launch and for the projects we're going to hear about today. So I am going to send this back to Mark to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Cassie. The syllabus modules are going to appear in each issue of the AHR. September was the first and going forward, and there'll be 1 or 2 modules that will appear each time. Rachel is sharing the syllabus webpage that we've created on the AHA site So there's two ways that you can come into this. You can come into it through the journal, if that's the way in which you're encountering the AHR. But if you like, you can also come in through the website. And our publisher, Oxford University Press, has taken all the paywalls off for the syllabus modules. So people can get right in. They don't have to worry about, putting in codes or this or that. And you can do that again directly through the web page, or you can be doing it if you're navigating around our website. The first module that was in the September issue is focusing on historical smells. And it's put together by an interdisciplinary research team that we've been working with on some other issues in the history lab. And what they do is have some really easy to use videos and sort of textual explanations for how to get smell history right into the classroom. And it's a really, smell history is a kind of like leading edge of where some of the methodology is going in history right now. And they've just got all kinds of practical ways to make that easy to put into the classroom. We'll be running, as I said, 1 or 2 modules in every issue going forward. Those will all come up on the website too. I notice Ed Cohn is on the call with us today. He's one of the authors of an upcoming module. We have modules coming up on making historical podcasts, teaching with graphic novels, how to think about using material culture in your teaching with students. And as I say, there's about 10 or 15 of these that have already been commissioned, so they will keep going in this sort of living way that Kathy was talking about. In December, we're going to run Tor's module on historical gaming, and early next year, we'll be running Aya's module on historiography. So I want to turn things over to both of them right now. And I also want to say, as I do that, those of you who are on the call, if you've got questions as we go, just put them in the chat, and both Kathy and I will be paying attention to that and helping Tori and Aya get to some of those questions. So Tori, could I ask you to get started on historical gaming?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Mark and Kathy, for those introductions. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here with you all. And I'm eager to tell you a little bit about the unusual teaching I've been engaged in, and given a little bit of a teaser as to what will show up in the December issue of the AHR. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that just about every historian uses pop culture in their classroom. Whether it's films, books, TV shows, or Broadway plays, we often use hooks from mainstream culture to capture student interest and enthusiasm. However, historians have been noticeably less eager to give the same treatment to video games. And I don't think that's an accident. There's reasons why. Many historians didn't grow up playing digital games. Many are put off by the high time demands, technical skill, or expensive hardware that many games require. And maybe most importantly, many historians are leery of a medium that they closely associate with misogyny, senseless violence, Eurocentrism, or worse. Many believe that gaming is solely the domain of disaffected young white men. Of course, these stereotypes exist for some reason, but I think they were much truer 20 years ago than they are today. In the past decade, we've seen the size of the US gaming population dramatically increase. Pandemic lockdowns only accelerated earlier trends, and today, according to the Entertainment Software Association, a full 212 million Americans play video games at least 1 hour a week. That is 65% of the nation. And not surprisingly, as gaming audiences grow larger and more diverse, game developers have poured energy into developing games that speak to broader perspective. And this is especially true with historically inspired games, and recent years have seen many examples of games that think creatively about things like agency, causality, power, and inequality. Of course, even the best of these games provide incomplete views of history. But it is undeniable that they are cultivating a tremendous deal of historical curiosity among young people. Just take a poll among high schoolers or undergraduates as to the origins of their interest in history, and you'll see this borne out. So the real question is, should professional historians build on this curiosity, or will we continue to ignore it? Given the crisis in national historical literacy and the declining or stagnant enrollment of history majors, I believe that it's vital that we pay close attention to what's taking place on our students' digital screens and consider how it can advance what we do in our teaching and in our scholarship. Now, since you already tuned into this webinar, I'm likely preaching to the choir for some of you. But most of you are probably wondering exactly how can an instructor do this effectively? And in the rest of my session today, I want to share my experience of teaching a college class that takes a single video game and uses it as a springboard to examine some of the thorniest subjects in modern American history, which is my field. So I did grow up as a gamer, coming of age in the 1990s, but I quit gaming when I got to college and never really looked back. That is, until the pandemic, when in search of a new lockdown hobby, I picked up the blockbuster historical game Red Dead Redemption 2, which was released in 2018. To say that this game is popular would be an understatement. In its opening weekend, it earned more money than any other entertainment product ever made before, including films or anything like it. In fact, I'd argue that by now, it is the most played and most influential American history game since the Oregon Trail. Red Dead Redemption 2, the game, is set in 1899, and it follows a ragtag bunch of bandits as they flee from authority across North America. If you've seen any of the marketing or advertising of that game, you might assume that it's solely about the West, fitting neatly into Hollywood's cowboy genre. But in reality, it's a lot more than that. Only about half the game is set in the West, and dozens of hours are spent in the Deep South, in Southern Appalachia, and in the Caribbean. Now, when it comes to the history portrayed on screen in this game, Red Dead Redemption 2 is always incomplete. But it's nevertheless surprisingly thoughtful quite often. The game's storyline touches on big questions like native dispossession, the expansion of corporate capitalism, and the racial terror of lynching. And though the central protagonist of the game is a white man, Red Dead Redemption 2 does a great deal to capture the human diversity of the United States in 1899. Your gangmates and closest collaborators are women, African Americans, Mexicans, Native peoples, and immigrants. This is no John Wayne fantasy of brave white men winning the West. Simply not that. Now, I'd originally picked up this game for fun, but it wasn't long before the historian in me got quite excited. And my first instinct was to design an upper division undergrad class that used this single game to attract students to the dilemmas of late 19th and early 20th century American history. And that is what I dreamed up in late 2021, a class called Red Dead America, the real history behind the hit video games. Now, this course could have taken shape in any number of ways, and I'm eager to see other historians try other approaches. But here's how I decided to design it. The class had no prerequisites and was indeed aimed to try to attract non-majors. I did not require students to buy or to play the game, nor did I ever examine them on their knowledge of that game. And in fact, the structure of the course was quite traditional, blending lectures with group discussions of secondary and primary sources. But students would not be disappointed. The video game was always present in some way. Following the storyline of Red Dead Redemption 2, I organized the course geographically, with units first on the West, then the Deep South, and Appalachia, all during this 1880 to 1920 period. And the topic of every single class meeting linked up to some moment in the game's storyline. For example, to kick off every lecture, I showed a few minutes of game content, usually via YouTube videos embedded in my PowerPoints. However, there were a handful of times when I actually did play the game in class with them when recorded videos couldn't do the trick. And though 95% of our time together was spent on traditional historical topics, I always took care to link class material to the game's content. At the very center of the course was the question of violence. Red Dead Redemption 2, like many popular video games, is a blood-soaked affair. But then again, so was America in the age of settler colonialism, the New South, and the scramble for Appalachia. However, in the video games, violence usually flares at random, triggered by things like robberies, poker games, and alcohol. In the class, I aimed to show that violence was instead quite often entangled with two towering social dilemmas of the day: First, whether the nation would live up to the racial egalitarianism promised by Reconstruction, and then second, what power would a rising capitalist elite wield over common people? Overall, the class has been an absolute joy to teach. Student engagement is the highest I've ever seen, both in terms of enrollment, which has been unprecedented for a course of this type, and in terms of daily enthusiasm and excitement among the students. This experience also motivated me to write a book based on the class, aimed primarily at gamers and teachers who might want to reach them. And that book, which is titled Red Dead's History, a video game, an obsession, and America's violent past, will be coming out in the summer of 2024. Now, when we pivot to the breakout rooms here in just a few minutes, I'm eager to chat more about the rewards and challenges that came up during this semester. But let me wrap up by returning to that demographic dilemma that has kept so many historians from using video games in the past. This understanding that video games are this toxic echo chamber for young white men and few others. Now that I've taught this course twice, I can speak to the kinds of students that it attracts. There is no doubt that white men are overrepresented in the class ranks, though women, students of color, and non-binary students always make up between 1/4 and 1/3 of the class. Now, this relative homogeneity of the classroom is troubling, as my colleagues, of course, and myself want to see the diversity of our major increase rather than decrease. But I do see a silver lining with this demographic imbalance. My class is fundamentally about race, violence, gender, and inequality, and there is, quite simply, no single demographic group that needs to grapple with this history more than white men. So with that in mind, I see this class as presenting a rare opportunity to breach these crucial topics with a demographic that is sometimes reluctant to enroll in classes that explicitly speak to such concerns. And as an example of that, I encourage you all to check out my module in the forthcoming issue of the AHR. You'll see that the class topic that I selected to provide a lesson plan for is not about the Western cowboy, but on the campaign for women's suffrage, and particularly what that looked like in the 1890s South, when Jim Crow was colliding with the push for women's rights. I hope that this module is illustrative of the wide range of topics that a video game can help us teach. Thanks everyone for listening, and I'm very eager to continue the conversation in our breakout rooms.
Aya, you want to go ahead?
Hi. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. That was a fascinating presentation. I'm really, really happy to be here and really happy to share this work with you, which is very different on teaching with historiography, and to be able to share that work in the AHR syllabus. So I'm just going to share my screen to organize myself with some slides here. So the first thing about this project really is that it's been underway for a while now, several years in different iterations, and it's deeply collaborative and deeply interdisciplinary. So my background is in modern European history. My colleagues, Abby Reisman is teaching at the Penn Graduate School of Education, and she was the director of the Stanford Reading Like a Historian curriculum when it first came out about a decade ago. And then our colleague Brenda Santos has over 2 decades of work in curriculum and school leadership, and she's currently at the Annenberg Institute at Brown. And so together, we brought these different experiences that we've had professionally to tackle this challenge. Is it possible, and how is it possible, to bring historians' debates into the high school classroom, where we have many more constraints than we would with undergraduate or graduate classrooms? And I should mention that our focus has been on the high school classroom, but we've also had many conversations with colleagues in higher education, especially those teaching survey courses, introductory courses for undergraduates. So hopefully some of this will be interesting to you regardless of your teaching context. So this project is really primarily about articulating a method, the how, articulating templates and processes for doing this translation, and we call it the work of translating historians' work into the realities of the high school classroom. But I'm going to start with the content of this unit that is coming up in the syllabus on the testimonies and then go from that to the more sort of underlying methodological questions. So this unit on the historiography of Holocaust testimony came up partly as a response to this dilemma, which came up in the course of my work here at the Fortunoff Archive, which is this, that today, if a student looks out at, what they see as far as testimony is that it is a venerated source, it is a ubiquitous source, and it is impossible really to imagine writing about the Holocaust without testimony, without the voices of victims. And so the challenge there is, how do we help students to understand that this was not always the case, that this is a relatively recent development, and with that, to really unpack how it is that historians work together, how do they debate one another, change their points of view so that the construction of historical knowledge changes over time. So in the unit itself, we decided to focus on this question: what is the role of survivor testimony and voices of victims in the study of the Holocaust? So a methodological question, we want to explicitly include that part, not just survivor testimony, but also voices of victims, those who did not survive, but who left various first-person accounts in the ghettos, those archives. And what this unit does is it brings students into the historiographical space by having them read excerpts from these three historians in a very deliberate and sort of structured way. And each of these historians is there to represent a different approach to working with testimony. So you'll recognize these as iconic texts. We start with Martin Broszat, who wrote the concentration camps back in 1965, deliberately without testimony. So his text illustrates that reliance on German government documents and not including the voices of the victims. Then, of course, there's the Broszat-Friedlander debate. And so then we turn to Friedlander's Years of Extermination to have students look at what in Friedlander's particular instance, his view of integrated history of the Holocaust, the voice of the victim comes to sort of pierce through various certainties, or this kind of domesticated narrative as he saw it at the time of the Holocaust. And then we turn to Christopher Browning, who writes a little bit later than Friedlander, but takes a very different approach to the voices of survivors. And that approach is to both include them in the narrative, but in a specific way, which is to recover facts that could not be recovered otherwise without testimony. So that's the sort of content of it that we're doing. Of course, the challenge is to do this without the luxury of having students read these books, or even chapters from these books. We really have to work with very short excerpts. So what teachers will get in this unit will be a guide for teachers, a sort of overview of the historiography, very quick, a few pages just to get oriented, and then a document packet for students and guiding questions that can be adapted. So all of this is really difficult to design, as you can imagine, trying to abstract and condense this immense decades-long debate and evolution in the scholarship into a short document set like this. So, and the other piece too, of course, here, the AHR syllabus itself is part of a over a century-long conversation of professional historians with high school classrooms. And for us, it's really wonderful to be able to participate in that. And what we want to do with this project is to make a very specific intervention about how the way that historians and classroom teachers can connect. And that way is to propose to develop through research, our own research, as well as relying on existing research in history education, a curricular template that is based in models of learning that really takes into account how adolescents read and learn, and the classroom realities that teachers work with. Then that template gets filled out with historical scholarship, different debates. In this case, it's Holocaust testimonies. We have other examples as well. We conduct professional development sessions with teachers to learn with and from them. And then we learn from classroom implementations going back to refining the models of learning. So this project came out of this moment where in my own teaching, undergraduate teaching, I was trying to bring historiography into that context in meaningful ways. And I connected with Abby, who had this model called the document-based lesson. So if you know the Reading Like a Historian project, that's probably familiar. It has a central question, primary sources in conversation with that, and then instructional sequences that support student engagement. So we brought those experiences together to create something we're calling the historiography-based inquiry. And that inquiry, in a way, it builds on that model and goes beyond it, right? Because we want students to work with secondary texts. And that has a lot of challenges, right? So we are sharing some of our dilemmas in one of the pieces that will come with the unit of, how do we select central questions for these types of inquiries? Will they be more methodological, like the ones that I just shared, or should they be more grounded in history and actual historical questions that have been debated by historians? For example, in the Russian Revolution, did Bolsheviks have popular support when they seized power in October of 1917? Right, so those always, we think about both the pedagogy around it and the history and state and maintaining as much fidelity as possible to the original historiographical debates. Then we attempt to represent the bigger structure of these debates to both teachers and students to ground them in the flow of argument, the flow of different evolution of methodologies. So I'll leave that for the essay. There's a lot more to say there. And the document packet itself is the heart of it. And there the dilemmas have to do with how do we choose these excerpts from these longer works? How do we scaffold them for students to have enough context to understand them? And how do we present them so that students can really engage in very deep reading and then discussion rounds that deal with different aspects of historians' work as well as the content at hand? And then finally, how do we connect the secondary sources in these document sets to the primary sources that historians cite? In the case of the testimonies unit, we're connecting the document set itself. One of the testimonies that Christopher Browning cites is a testimony here at the Fortune Archive given by Manja Kaufman in 1988. And so this will be linked to the unit itself so that you can explore sort of with the testimony interview methodology from the Fortune Archive that centered the voice of the witness. You can listen to that interview that he analyzes in an excerpt. And also it's there to help students make that distinction between testimony as a unique complex source and the person who gave the testimony, whose experience goes beyond that moment of giving it and beyond the trauma that they experienced in the Holocaust. So with all of that, the process of working on this with Mark and the AHR team has just been incredibly helpful to us to articulate the layers. There's so many layers here of how do we enter students into the space? How do we help them make sense of it in a way that helps their learning and is not overwhelming, right, in the short amount of time that they have in classrooms. So one thing that came out of it is this essay where we try to be transparent about our principles of design. We hope that essay will become an invitation to future partnerships for building more models in the modules in the future. Another piece that came out of these conversations has been articulating these discussion rounds for the pedagogy around this so that students can sort of tease it apart layer by layer. We will start with historians' positionality, their context, the society that they're embedded in, various power structures. Then from that, move on to their specific examples of how they argue, how they use sources. From there, move on to the sources themselves. And then finally, step back and think of the broader significance of that debate and the different sides in the debate. So our next steps will be first to publish the unit in the March issue. We are working on another unit on the historiography of Reconstruction and emphasizing the agency of freed people during that time. We'll be offering pedagogy workshops around it to continue evolving the method in the spring and going forward. And we hope to be in touch with all of you. So there's a link, I think that Jake might drop if you'd like to get on our mailing list and be in touch about these things. And I'm excited to talk more in the breakout rooms.
Great, Aya, thank you. So Jake, you magically put us in our rooms.
Much for joining me, and I'm really eager to hear your input, field your questions, and talk more about certain questions. I noticed that there was a question in the chat previously, which I'll start off by addressing, which had to do with the student demographics at the University of Tennessee, where I teach, right? Because I mentioned that there's a whole lot of white men at the in these classes, right? And how representative of this is it of the university or history classes as a whole? So for many reasons, right, both in terms of the location within the state of Tennessee and past practices, the about 78% of this campus is white, right? So that's much higher than many other institutions. About 5% are African American, and about 6% are Latino, about 3% Asian. The racial dynamics in my class aren't that different. It's the gender dynamics, right? The university is 55% female, and the history major is more than a majority female as well. My classes are, this class, most of my classes are also majority female, but not the video game class, right? So I don't see that it has much of an impact on racial demographics. So they would look very different at a more diverse institution, and mine is hardly among the leaders in that field. But it's really the gender component that I've picked up on the most. But what do you all have to add to the conversation? I'm very eager to hear your input and suggestions and all, and questions and all that. Brendan's got his hand up, so go on ahead.
Sure. Thanks for a great presentation there. I'm just curious. I teach a class on the history of Britain in 12 murders. And one of the trickiest things for me is managing student expectations, because I use murder as a lens through which to explore, issues of race, gender, empire, etc. How do you present what the course is going to be about early on, and do you find that you ever get pushback from your students?
Right, in terms of what they're going to expect out of it, or yeah, I mean, it dovetails with the question in the chat too about whether I lose students when they realize that I won't be playing the game. So I do play the game a bit, but they don't get any course credit from playing the game in that sort of way. The game will contribute enthusiasm to their enjoyment of the class, but never will it help them get a higher grade in any sense whatsoever. But linking up to your really innovative class on murders in British history, which sounds terrific. There's a lot that I have to leave out, right? Because I make the content of the course emphasize the sorts of topics that are in the game, which is primarily rural, Western, and Southern games. So certain key developments that are playing out in New York and Chicago, might not get the same amount of emphasis unless they tie in with the topics that we're discussing on those days. And so it's a little difficult to, it's not a survey class, right? And they kind of go in knowing that. It's an upper division course for a reason, knowing that the content is fairly, not narrow, but limited in some regards.
So direct your attention to the chat, and maybe you could answer a little bit more fully. I think Christy wanted to know, do you actually lose students when they realize that, oh, we're not playing in the game? And then I think Paul is asking, says that they do in fact play in his classes. And I think when you say why not, Paul, you're asking why not play the game.
Yeah, why not play the game and make that more of a part of the class, to give them credits, to fully immerse themselves in the game rather than making it sort of just the framing device.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I thought long and hard about requiring the game as a part of the materials for the course, and what kept me from doing so was the fact that it's so expensive, right? I mean, the game itself is $60. Then you got to shell out $400, $500 for a gaming console, or even more for a gaming PC, plus a screen, all this. We're talking about, many students will, of course, have the game already. So this is not an extra expenditure, but many would not. And I would say that of the students who've taken the class, I've taught it twice at this point, so I've reached about 110 students total. About 2/3 come into the class, having played the game quite a bit. I mean, I'd say 1/3 are like hardcore junkies of the game who know much more about it than I do. I mean, I haven't devoted that much time to it ultimately compared to them. But about 1/3 of them have heard of it. I mean, everyone's heard of it, but they haven't played it. And I found, I'm very proud, that many of the students who've never had any exposure to the game enjoy the class just as much, right? They enjoy learning about the game, and while they're also learning the history that's, informing some of the game. So I've never had students leave because they're not playing the game. They leave when they realize that it's a serious history class, that has significant writing assignments and reading, just the same as any other history course would. But it's a very low number, right? And again, the levels of enrollment are much, much higher than they've been in other courses that I've taught. We have to double the capacity of the course, and there's the possibility of even doing a higher cap for it. But most of them who sign on stay on, which has been really rewarding.
So we have a question about well, the limits of technology, I guess. So let's say, you know, 10 years down, 10 years down the line, it's no longer possible, or I can add to that and say the technology has evolved in a different way. How do you anticipate making adjustments to the syllabus?
Right. Yeah. So when you teach with pop culture, obviously, the pop culture of 2 generations ago is significantly less punchy with students than it is of that of today. And as we all know, pop culture memories are brief, and fads move on. And video games generally, most video games have very short sticking power. The issue is that this particular game is made by this massive juggernaut company called Rockstar Games. Pretty much anything they make sticks around for at least a decade. So this game, Red Dead Redemption 2, has a longer shelf life than most games, but it's still short, right? Like in 5 years, perhaps even in 2 years, I don't foresee myself teaching this particular class. But what's interesting is that when I filed the paperwork to get this integrated as part of our catalog here, our regular curriculum, I did not submit the class as Red Dead America. I submitted it as American history in video games, which would keep this kind of, you know, digital history play element to it, but that the content is variable. And in fact, I'm right now developing my next replacement class for this, which is going to zoom out to look at a number of games, not just Red Dead Redemption 2, but to look at 20th century America in video games and look at several slices, you know, let's say 5 or 6 games that speak to various moments that we spend less time delving deep into and have a sort of different view to it. But I definitely see myself using digital games as teaching for quite some time to come. So I don't think it'll, you know, games are obviously not going away. That's one fad that is not passing. But the individual games themselves, instructors do have to be fairly flexible and, you know, nimble on their toes in order to respond to what's popular. And some people are not going to want to do that. I have no problem with that. I think it's quite interesting to see a lot of games are absolutely terrible, and many historical games are total embarrassments. But then there come along interesting ones that are at least worth the time in a classroom. And Red Dead Redemption 2 is not perfect. There's lots of problems with it, to be sure. I don't want anyone to think that I view this game as, you know, a teaching tool on its own. It is not that. But it provides enough kind of meat and potatoes that you can build something around it that is serious and much more illuminating.
So if nobody wants to jump in, I'll keep going from the chat. Maybe because this is a good follow-up. Ed Cohn wants to know, so you get these students in your class, are you getting, are they history majors? Are they outside your majors? And then the question of the moment, right, for history departments all over the country, are they moving on and they taking more history classes?
Yeah, right, of course. And this was the big pitch that I made to my higher ups in the history department, being like, not only is this class going to fill, but this is an opportunity to get, you know, to win some of those minors and majors. So I'm very entrepreneurial about this, and I planned this quite strategically. Right after I give what, in my opinion, is one of the best like lectures that dovetails with the material, I asked them, you know, how many of you guys are history majors? Well, you know, I know who's a history major at this point. But then I asked, you know, for those who are not history majors, why have you not signed up for a history major? And then they'll say, you know, well, my parents don't think that it's, you know, economically smart in the long run. They have all, you know, all the kind of stereotypes. And that's actually when I show the data from the AHA of where history majors work, right, where they actually do their jobs, and make this very, you know, passionate pitch about this is an all-purpose degree that can do all sorts of things for you. And I am very proud to say that I have won a number of majors through this class. It's not me alone. I've got lots of other great colleagues out there too. But there have been students, you know, from business, from computer science, engineering, who are like, I'm going to pick up a minor or do a double major or even just switch. I mean, there's one student who just switched to history. And I can't claim sole credit, but I know this class has had some significance in making those, you know, wow, history is meaningful and it's relevant in this day and age.
So Brendan asked, Aya mentioned that going through the process of submitting a module to AHR really made her rethink, clarify some issues regarding the process. Did you go through anything like that or are you're still in the process of revising here? Has your module evolved from the time you originally proposed it to this to where you are now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this morning the page proofs went in, so it is pretty much off of my hands. It is done, which is exciting. But how much did it change, right? So one of the big ways that it changed is that I started thinking a great deal more about secondary ed, right? Because I taught this as a college class, and in the back of my head, I'd always had this dream that high school students would be terrific candidates for this class because there's tons and tons of high schoolers who are just as immersed in this game, even though it's ranked 18 plus by the classifying authorities. Lots of 15-year-olds have been playing this game, I promise that. And I hadn't thought about that as much, and tried to rethink the place of secondary ed in the classroom with some success, limited success, I should say. I compared this to the Oregon Trail previously, which, I think it's a sort of inheritor in some ways. So I think a much better game in certain ways in terms of perspective, right? This is not a sort of white settler colonial fantasy of the West. It's a lot more nuanced than Oregon Trail was. But Oregon Trail had the partnership of schools. Like, this was an educational product that was being pushed in classrooms, from like 4th grade onward. I was a recipient of these myself. Very few school systems are going to adopt Red Dead Redemption 2 in the computer lab, right? Because it's bloody, it has profanity, and that gives it the allure that students, high school students, they think it's cool, while Oregon Trail was quirky, but it was never cool, right? It's not something that you did on your home time after school. But many of these students have spent, hundreds of hours immersed in this game. So in that sense, thinking about secondary ed, I still have a long way to go. And my great hope is that there will be high school teachers who pick up my book when it comes out next year and try this experiment in some of their classrooms. But there's a chance it might be confined to a sort of like extracurricular history club kind of thing, just because of the pushback of, not just politically conservative, but just kind of, of school boards or PTAs that are anxious about video game violence. And, that's something to be anxious about.
Again, y'all feel free to kind of chime in and ask your questions as well. But Christy wanted to know, just to clarify a little bit, are you looking at freshman, sophomore? What year students are we talking about here?
Yeah, it's really across the board. I think it's pretty neatly divided up into quarters for each year. Quarters are seniors, a quarter are freshmen. Probably about 40% have been history majors as a rule, which is a much lower number than most of the upper division history classes that I usually teach. So we do get lots of non-history folks, but in terms of the age distribution or class distribution, it's fairly even. And again, because there's no prerequisites, there's certain kinds of upper division credit that they get at the university. But I've been trying to promote this very actively, right? So one of the key ways that the class filled to such a large size when it was first offered is because I was very active on social media, publicizing this thing, right? And somehow it made it onto Reddit. I didn't put it there personally, but the students, were crazy. There were thousands and thousands of responses to it. And when word got out, among UT undergraduates, they were there when it mattered during registration week. But in trying to reach a larger student audience too, I've kind of tried flexing new muscles that I wouldn't otherwise. So for example, I'm teaching this class next semester, and registration week begins in about 2 weeks or so. Right during the heart of registration week, I'm going to be giving a talk on campus, partnered with the student engagement board, like the campus events board, the people who put on like student-centered programming on campus. They usually do nothing serious or academic, right? It's usually kind of fluffy stuff that students want, and hey, that's fine. I understand that. They got to have R&R as well. But I'm doing a thing on games and history, which is, really student focused, and is, does a lot of the same stuff that I do in class, probably even a little lighter than I might do in class. And then at the end, we're like, well, hey, if this catches your fancy, then you can sign up for the class. It's offered spring semester, and we'd love to have you. So my hope is to, to expand the numbers even more. Paul.
I love what you're doing, and I encourage anybody who's thinking about teaching with games to just go all in, to show people that being academically rigorous and having fun do not need to be mutually exclusive. And also mixing the media of games. You mentioned the women's suffrage focus. Are you using that new women's suffrage board game in your class to have them experience gaming, not just video, but also analog gaming, tabletop gaming? I think there's all kinds of things. I've been teaching with games for 20 years. I love it. I have students build games. I got rid of the lectures and all the typical stuff. It's so much fun. I highly encourage. Sorry, I'm taking up the time. It's going to close in 100 seconds, but I encourage anybody who's thinking about just to go all in and have fun with games. Don't feel like you need to hold back and feel like some students do, embarrassed that they learn history by playing games. It's a great way to learn history.
Yeah. So we have not, flirted with non-digital games, though I think there's lots of potential for that. But I'll say that, so I've taught the class twice now. The first time I offered it, I was still very traditionalist about some things. My experimentational energy was limited because I was worried, can I really get away with doing this? Not that anyone was actually going to say, hey, this is not a serious class, because obviously it was. And the syllabus, which will be available on AHR, will prove that. But as I've kind of leaned into it and gotten more comfortable in the class, I've gotten more creative, right? So like the assignments, the second go around, were much more leaning into game content, right? So for the final assignment in the class, I asked students to basically write a script for a serious historical fictional game, either in the Red Dead Redemption universe or kind of in that same 1880 to 1920 period. And I gave very firm guidelines about what they can and can't do, because you're tempting fate a little bit when you're asking 20-year-olds to dream up alternate universes. But I was really impressed with what they did, right? And I wouldn't have thought about doing that the first go around, because I was still just like, getting comfortable in the new clothes of teaching with games and the kind of unfair stigma that I think, some of the stigma is fair, but some of that stigma is not. And I was still kind of just getting comfortable with that. So maybe in this third go around, I'll try some things that I didn't even dream about in the second. That's a great idea. Great to hear that, Paul.
I think we may all be here.
That looks like it, everyone. All right, so I would welcome everybody. I would invite you to, if you'd like to turn on your screen so we can share some conversation. Or if you feel more comfortable dropping ideas or thoughts in the chat, that's great too. We'll both be monitoring that. So my first question would be just your teaching background, your teaching context. If you could maybe put in the chat what context are you teaching in the high school?
I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be in the other room.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. I don't know
think
if
that will be Jake. Mark, do you know how we can get in touch with Jake about that?
Yeah. Paul, it may take just a minute, but I'll work on that.
Okay, that's okay. Sorry to just interrupt.
No worries.
Not a problem. Yeah, so let's start. Just if you want to just drop in the chat the context that whether you're teaching high school or higher ed, that would help me get a better sense of your teaching. And also, since this is a smaller group, feel free to unmute yourself and share your context as well. So I see there's some high school teachers and then higher ed. Great. Great. So let me just open our conversation with this question to all of you in terms of your own experiences with teaching historiography outside of the graduate seminar, right? Where we have the time and ability to delve into it properly, right? In some ways, these are all ways of abstracting it. What are some of the things that have worked for you? And also, if there's any questions that you have about this particular unit or approach, I would be happy to talk about that.
I'll go first. So my name is Jaime Aguila. I've been a professor at small comprehensive institutions, universities, and at a Research One institution. And now I'm at a community college in West Texas. And so we don't really spend a lot of time with historiography at the freshman level at a Texas community college. All professors have to teach U.S. history. My scholarship was on Mexican history, and I teach European history, but we say U.S. history survey pays the bill. So it is very difficult currently to even have students read a textbook or have assigned reading. We're discouraged, although we're allowed to assign additional monographs or other books. We certainly assign articles. So what I've done is I've assigned historiographical articles on different topics like Reconstruction, but have had that reading assignment as part of some type of subjective history assessment, whether it's developing a lecture on Reconstruction for public school teachers, comparing high school to, say, elementary school, or even for if I have a smaller class with halfway through the semester, they're more advanced. I took on last semester this debate over critical race theory and I used the 1619 project as an example. I'll stop there, but it's generally difficult to teach historiography at the community college level.
Yeah, which is similar to the high school context in that sense, for sure. What about some other experiences? Yeah.
I wonder, Jaime, if, I'm sorry, I think I'm on. Oh, okay. Jaime, I'm wondering about this, your effort to bring some kind of historiographical understanding to students in an intro class. I wonder if it's ever possible to try to get older textbooks and the way in which they present key issues. I'm thinking of some of the more popular U.S. textbooks that were used, about 50 years ago. And since your students are reading textbooks, it could be a nice launching point to see how a textbook especially treated an issue like Reconstruction in 1960. And if that might be a way to hook students because you're using a source that they're familiar with.
If I can respond real quick, I see Kelsey has her hand up. The New York Review of Books, 3 issues ago, had a really good article on the historiography of the politics around the historiography of the textbook since the early 20th century. I'll see if I can find it, but I completely agree with you. And I'll stop there.
I do want to say just a word about, it seems to me you've been really careful about trying to figure out how to give students a very, very small amount of reading and still be able to draw out a larger and complex conversation about it. And, Jamie, going back to your point, there's not time and what you can assign. I think some of that is embedded in how you've thought about setting the project up. Is that right, Aya?
Yeah, for sure. Because in the high school setting, we really start with, there are 40 minutes in the classroom and students will be just varied reading levels. They may be at grade level, they may not be at grade level, right? And we want to, and so the question there is, if you're going to introduce historiography, you probably are going to have literally just a page at a time, half a page with annotations. And so what we thought about is there a way of excerpting from this larger scholarship? And that's where the time-intensive component of this project comes in. So we know that teachers, and even in the undergraduate survey course, the instructor teaching it doesn't have the time to go through the scholarship and excerpt these very brief pieces of it that will do a lot of the kind of pedagogical work that we'd like them to get, right? And so what we ended up doing is for each historian, first to try to get 2 different types of excerpts. The first type of excerpt has more to do with their stance about the methods and about the problem at hand, something perhaps to do with their positionality, where students can see that person, hear that person, again, in very few words and carefully introduced, but having some sense of how they approach the subject, right? But then from that's typically, when there's illustrations of historiography in textbooks, oftentimes it will be either that sort of thing or a summary of opposing viewpoints, opposing arguments, right? So we don't want to go to the summary because in some way that's just replicating a textbook approach, right? So we want to give the voice of the historian with a bit of introduction first with that stance. And then second, to move to examples within their narrative where, again, in a space of a couple of paragraphs, you know, we might take 2 or 3 examples from each historian's book to have paragraphs that illustrate how that historian makes a point with sources, right? How they bring in and marshal evidence to support what they're saying so that students can unpack it, sort of go a step before analyzing primary sources and look at how a historian does it, again, with this very miniature kind of form. And then from that, then the next step would be to look at primary sources if that's where the instructor wants to go, or we stop there and then we move to the next historian and compare their both stance and way of arguing and the kinds of sources that they use. And then that contrast becomes really helpful. And we try to do it in a way that really is short, you know, just is possible to do within a couple of class periods, if that's all that the teacher has. Yeah, Mark, did you want to?
Yeah, no, that's good. I just wanted to see if Kelsey wanted to get in because I see you in the chat, but
yeah, I was sorry, my camera isn't cooperating today.
That's okay.
So I dropped a link in the chat because I have done that with work with old textbooks before. I often teach world history classes, and so I'm a South Asianist by training, but I teach a lot of the world history to 1500 and world history from 1500. And it might be the nature of the class itself, but one thing that has been really useful in engaging students in this question of historiography and the trends and changes that scholarship goes through is the extent to which they tell me, I've never heard about this before. Why have I never heard about this before? And they, whether it's an ancient empire or a particular set of sources, a community, and I often am able to lean into that as an opening and go, okay, well, let's think about like why you haven't heard about that before. Let's talk about why that has been left out. The other thing in terms of looking at the latest trends, I was going to drop another link in here that I've just started using with my digital history students with the JSTOR text analyzer, which helps students. You can drop in a document, whether it's a paper that you're writing or for them having them use a proposal for a project, and then it looks for common key terms and themes and recommends scholarly articles. And having them try to filter that by the most recent and look to see how the most recent scholarship is talking about this topic. And often they have started immediately saying, okay, well, it's starting with this summary of what it's building on, and what it's building on is already different from what the textbook has. So they're seeing this constant engagement with an ongoing conversation rather than one that I think they typically view as static.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that question of understanding what students come in with, right? Their idea that, and their role also. I think part of what we're grappling with is unhooking that equation that students have between history and the past, right? That it's one and the same thing, and it is a list of facts that they're there to memorize and then to share back, right? But to really open it up and go beyond the construction from primary sources where, you know, that I think that goes a long way, right, towards engaging them in this process of making sense of the past, but then also to give them the sort of apprenticeship, miniature version of apprenticeship, where they can kind of look in on a historian's way of analyzing just one source, making just one claim, and seeing how much goes into that. That I think that can be, that we found that in, so one of the things we've done with students is, in terms of research, is to do these think aloud studies where we give them these excerpts from historians to see, is this really going to be helpful to them, or is it just not going to do what we think it will do? And in that, having a little bit of framing, doing some of these exercises with them, sort of teaching them how a historian might approach that text, taking line by line this text and saying, how would I test if this is accurate? Like, how would I find out? And having them brainstorm different sources around that. That has helped to unhook that static view of history a little bit and get them to ask more questions and get them to think about other ways to test that same claim. So that's another way that I think speaks to what you were talking about in terms of moving them away from that very fixed idea of what history is and their role vis-a-vis history. But I see Julia, you have your hand up, and then Jaime.
Jaime actually had his hand up first, so if he wants to.
Okay, so let's do that.
In the state of Texas, everyone in college has to have 6 hours of U.S. history 1, 1301, 1302. But we also have an option where we have a Mexican American history option that'll fulfill. We have a 2411, 2412 that'll fulfill the same survey requirements, meaning that course counts for any major the same as the traditional survey. And we also have the same for African American history 1 and 2. So to add a caveat to this is I've thought about, and you have this discussion what's going on, of using a Mexican American history survey textbook for my U.S. history survey. Being a Mexican historian and living in Texas on the borderlands, for example, Kelly Little Hernandez just came out with a book called Bad Mexicans, and there's really good research on both sides of the border. So now that we're having this discussion for another AHA session, there's something about using non-traditional textbooks, and I'll stop there.
And my question is quick, and I'd like to hear from Robert too while we still have time. So just quickly, do you find that students go too quickly? I've heard this from other faculty, which is why I'm asking. Do go too quickly from a single narrative to, well, it's just this person's opinion? And how do you keep them away from those two extremes in terms of understanding what it means to make, what goes into a historical interpretation?
Absolutely. So I think that's the question of both destabilizing whatever it is, whether it's a dominant narrative or the single narrative, and then stabilizing the idea that there is knowledge that is shared that does go beyond individual opinions. So, even in the research settings, we have found that students, they will fall back on their own opinion. And then the next step from that is to relativize and to say, well, then in the end, it is either just all ideology or opinion. And so partly what we try to do there is to point to these larger, that we call them argument maps or different schematics that we introduce to help them understand the kind of evolution over time of these arguments and the standards of argumentation, right? That there may be all kinds of pressures and there may be all kinds of reasons why a historian begins to interpret a certain way. It may be archival openings, it may be political events at the time, right? But in this process, one of the essential anchoring pieces is that this profession has standards of how a sound argument is made, right? Of evidence and ways of working with that evidence. And so that's the piece where we try to really help them create that sense of stability, that there is an anchoring there, and it's in the shared professional practices that they can then participate in as well. Is that helpful? Or yeah. And then Robert, I see you have your hand up.
Okay, and I'll try to finish this in less than 106 seconds. Just real quickly, I'm at a small liberal arts college in Northeast Georgia. We have about 950 or so students, but and in profile, they're probably similar to Jaime's situation. And in fact, I've adjuncted at community college, so I know what he's dealing with in terms of requirements and capabilities and things like that. We're blessed though with a significant international population, and a lot of times what I will do is have international students share their perspectives on things that American students think they know, but that they don't know, and that's been very helpful. The second thing I do that I've tried to do in a number of classes is resurrect an old pedagogical tool called debates. So like in Western Civs 1 or World, we debate the fall of the Western Roman Empire. What are the reasons? Was it the barbarians? And the answer is no.
sort of. And so they have to go and actually figure out what the factors were. They can't rely on old historiography that, oh, it was barbarian invasions, took them down, and that's it, end of story. So they have to wrestle with that. I've done debates on the cause of the Industrial Revolution. Why did it happen in Britain? And you have to disabuse them of the old notion of Eurocentrism and all of that. I use the Robert Marks book for that. But they have to go and find sources. They've got to go and find historiographic sources that talk about all those reasons. So, Ken Pomeranz and others that have argued the different reasons and all of that. So I found that that's been very effective.
It's so abrupt when they pull you out of the room. We were right in the middle of a conversation, and
now I call it the rapture.
Yeah.
And I apologize for not leaving any time.
Oh no, not at all, Robert. It's just the constraints of the hour and the format. We just have a few minutes, and I think what we thought we'd do to close things out was, Kathy, you just talk a bit about maybe highlights of the conversation that were going on in your room, and whatever else you'd like to say, and then I'll do something of the same.
Sure. We had exactly the conversation we had hoped, and it ran the gamut from a lot of discussion about how do you really engage students, and should students. Tori was great about talking about, and another contributor, Paul Milliman, were interested in talking about, do we have students play the games? Should we require them to engage in some way? How can you increase engagement? And the fun of this, embracing the fun of this, and it is okay to have fun as you learn about history, and then that actually tracked very well with the second theme, which is enrollments. Who is taking these classes, and can you use a course like this and the fun and the engagement of a class like this to draw more students into the major? And so how can you build on this, on the fun and the engagement of video games and the true learning that's happening and going forward? So.
Yeah, and you have an advertisement for San Francisco too, I think, Kathy.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Thank you. If you all are interested in hearing more, we're going to continue this conversation in San Francisco at a panel on AHR Syllabus, and we'll be having similar conversations in a similar setup. So please join us.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We had a really good conversation too. And, part of it was about where's the time to go with historiography? And then given that limited time, what are the most effective ways to dive in? And one person was saying that one of the advantages of trying to teach in that manner is that in her experience, the first question students usually says, well, I've never heard of that. And then she could come back with, well, I wonder why, right? And that can open up a conversation in a way about what the historiographical piece can do. There was an interesting conversation about whether textbooks could do some of what Aya's talking about in the method that they're developing. Could you look back at a textbook from the 60s or the 70s and use that, again, small chunks of that as a kind of opening up to think about how perceptions have changed over time? But then also an interesting comment about the emergence now of very non-traditional textbooks that are trying to tell very, very different stories, and whether that's an opening, right? So whether you're doing it kind of from the present in an alt textbook, or whether you're doing it from the past in a more traditional one. And then finally, just a reminder about, something that I think all of us have used in classrooms at one point or another is the debate format, and the way in which this kind of historiographical conversation lends itself nicely to that. And it doesn't motivate all students, but it does motivate quite a lot of students in some ways as a way of getting people thinking about it. So it was a great conversation. It was nice to also hear Aya have a chance to expand just a little bit on how, the larger principles of what she's working with. I want to say just a couple of things before we close things out, and I hand it back to Julia. One is, Tori's module is the first one that's going to come. That's going to come in the December issue. Aya's won't come until March. And we're just at the final design stages of his module. It ought to be done in the next week or so. And we're going to send that out to everybody who's been on this, just so you can get a kind of preview of what's coming. And excuse me. And, you know, because these are free, you don't have to worry about like copyright or sharing them or whatever. So if you look at it and you think, wow, I know a colleague who could, you know, might really be interested in this, if you could get it out to them. Because I think part of this syllabus project is just getting the word out from colleagues, and people are most likely to trust you if something's coming from you and you say, yeah, I thought that was really useful. So we'll get those to you, and if you can get them in circulation for us, that would be great. If you would like to pitch a module to the project, we'd also be delighted to have you do that. And that website that we had up at the beginning of the time, this is the AHR website for #AHR Syllabus. Rachel's putting it up again for us. There's a little box you click toward the bottom of it. Yeah, right there. And it'll get you to a form, just a couple of things that we want to know. Mainly a title, a sense of the kind of thing you might want to do in the module, and it can just open up a conversation with you and us about how to take that forward. So again, if that's something that is appealing to you, be in touch. We'd be delighted to hear from you. I want to thank two people who are only spectral presences on these Zooms, as is often the case. So Brendan Gillis is the AHA Manager of Teaching and Learning. He's the one who put this together for us. Jake Purcell, who you can see up on the screen, is the AHA Meetings and Programming Assistant. He does the magic that makes it all work, and I'm deeply grateful to both of them for helping us out with this. This is a new AHA Learn series, and we're the first, I guess, to be in it, so that's exciting for us. And again, we appreciate being included in that. I want to thank Aya and Tori and Kathy for being here today, and mainly to thank all of you for spending an hour with us this afternoon as we get what I hope you will see as a new and exciting teaching project launch from HR and from the AHA. So thanks so much. And Julia, let me send it to you.
Thank you. This concludes introducing the AHR Syllabus project. And just as a final note, if you're already a member of the AHA, thank you. If you're not a member right now, if you were a member before or not, we hope you'll join today and support work like this. We'll post a link to the webpage for membership in the chat. And additionally, please keep an eye out for future events in the AHA Learn series. The next one will be on November 15th, so before Thanksgiving. November 15th, and we will mark the 10th anniversary of the C3 framework for social studies standards. Thank you for everyone for attending.